Please, O Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths. Please, O Lord our God, make the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, guys. Shabbat shalom, everybody. Today is kind of a neat Shabbat because we're moving into camp in a couple of weeks, and we've been working really hard, our camp team and whatnot, to pull together all the details and things like that. And this year we came up with a really cool theme for our youth camp. Of course, for those of you who don't know, our youth camp is a 2-week-long overnight sleepaway adventure camp that's awesome and epic and wonderful, and you guys have heard a lot about it. We also like to take the curriculum very seriously and go really deep with the teens and really pray about what it is that we need to do this year. And this year our team came up with a really interesting theme called Living Foundations, Reasons for Faith. And the idea was the past few years we've gone really deep into like even some emotional healing kinds of things and really neat topics. This year we want to start answering hard questions that our campers are going to come up with as they go through school, as they enter college, and how do they navigate some of those really challenging questions that can come up? And we want to ask those questions and address them at camp. So that's what the plan here. Now, what I like to do is share with you little tidbits of camp curriculum every summer before we get into it, and that way I get to practice, right? But then also you get to kind of connect with what we're doing, and it's good, holistic all around. Now, a few weeks ago we had Perry Phillips here, and he shared with us about how the Bible and science, modern science, actually can really go together as opposed to compete with each other. And what I want to do today is keep going on that topic. That'll be the beginning of our camp. We go about science and God, and we're going to move into Jewish life, and then we're going to move into Yeshua's Messiahship. And I want to go back to the beginning and begin to address some of the questions that come up when you read Genesis 1. Of course, the photographs here are not of the actual events because they don't exist, but I did find some cool photographs on NASA's website that I think are really cool. So what we're going to do is go back through Genesis here. Now, I want to start by saying I'm not a scientist. I wish I could stand up here and be like, that's my doctoral degree or whatever. It's not. My master's degree is in Jewish studies. My job here is more to report to you what I've learned from scientists who do have the doctoral degrees, and to then context that for us. And I want to give credit to Dr. Bob Newman, who took a good amount of time to do an interview with me on this topic, and which is just really fun to engage and ask some of the questions to him. Now, I think that we like to have things in really neat categories, just by way of introduction. We find that most people put themselves in categories for the beginning of the Torah. There's young earth people who feel that they must read Genesis in a literal way. Now, it's a literal way as they understand a literal way to be. And then hold fast to a world that was created in 24-hour, 6 days, some 6,000 plus years ago. Then there's many science people out there who feel that they must reject the biblical story entirely as a mythological fairy tale in favor of current scientific consensus that the universe is actually some 13.7 billion years old, and that the Earth is some 4.5 billion years old. Big difference between billions and billions and 6,000. In more fundamental Jewish groups, and same with Christian groups, it seems as though you have to choose one or the other. It's like science or faith, and you got to hold on to your faith, or hold on to your science. Throw the Bible under the bus. Now, to be fair, there's a third approach that some people take for Genesis 1, which is to read it in a purely figurative way, like a myth, if you will, that's not necessarily true, but the idea is that it wasn't intended to be historically true. It's more intended to teach a lesson about God. And so the idea is you can hold on to faith and see this as a story that's not supposed to reflect what we would find in current day science, not actually as things went down. Now, I think there's problems with each of those three ways of looking at it. The problem with rejecting faith for science worldview is that science by its nature is always changing. The purpose of science is not to find truth. The purpose of science, ultimately, to get closer to it, but the purpose of science is to posit hypotheses that we then attempt to challenge and then to replicate. But then those hypotheses, according to the scientific method itself, need to be falsifiable. In other words, we need to be able to prove them wrong, or at least have the ability to prove them wrong, so that they can be changing and growing. That's how the scientific world grows. Everything is always changing. Science, you can't believe in anything in science. That's not the point of science. The point of science is to come closer to understanding more things, but then you always have to have the idea that something new will come and will change that thing. That's the scientific method. Does that make sense? And of course, a new discovery can always change something. For example, with Genesis, what would happen if we were to discover that our formulas were off for radioactive dating of different kinds of heavy elements and astronomical calculations? If our formulas were off, then everything we've come to know about 13.7 billion years would be totally wrong. And that would change everything. Now, I do think, having looked into it, that that's unlikely. But if you ditch your faith because you took a scientific hypothesis to be true, then you've lost something very important, you see? Also, I think it's just as problematic to reject science for your faith, because God gives us nature as a way of revealing himself. It's part of what he's given to us. And while some people do feel that they can write off the creation story as ancient fiction and still hold on to faith in God, I do know people who do that. To me, it feels like it lacks substance. It's very difficult to pass on from one generation to the next, and it leaves us with a Bible that dichotomizes between spiritual categories and the actual world around us, which I think is something foreign to Judaism at its core. Judaism is a religion of the world, a religion of the experience that we have. The world in a good sense. I don't mean it in the negative sense. And I want to suggest to us a middle ground approach that we're going to walk through. Now, C.S. Lewis calls this the true myth, is the way he looks at Genesis 1. Because a myth doesn't necessarily mean it's true or not. A myth is just a kind of literature. It's a kind of story. It's something that's been told over time from a people group. And so if it's a myth, it's passed and crafted down from generation to generation with lots of lessons and things that's learned. But the true myth would be a myth that's contexted in that way, but that it actually happened at the same time. So it wasn't meant to be a scientific handbook for the creation of the universe. Nonetheless, it's an accurate view of what did happen. So when we step back and read Genesis 1 in that way, we see an amazing thing happen. Rather than contradict our current scientific theories of the evolution of creation and how that's come to be, it seems to confirm it. So let's walk through that and see what we find. Now, there's 2 points we need to look at. The first is that the story is phenomenological. Phenomenological. Can you say that? That's a hard word. Phenomenological. That was for me so I could get it off my tongue. What that means is that it's written from the perspective of what we would see, not from the perspective of how it actually works. So the example would be a sunrise is a phenomenological term. The sun doesn't actually rise. The earth rotates. But we would look at the sun, it appears so that it rises, so we can say with confidence it's a sunrise. Does that make sense? That's what I mean. You guys know that. It's based on what we're watching. Now, perhaps whomever told the first story of Genesis, perhaps it was Moses, like our Jewish tradition suggests. Perhaps it was handed down from generations before or codified generations after. To me, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. The story reads as though it were told by someone who was actually given a vision of the beginnings of creation, like a camera view going back into time for what it looked like, and then telling the story. Eventually it's codified and written down by the hand of God, I would believe, in a process of inspiration in the book of Bereshit. Second, the term yom in Hebrew, which is translated day, has a range of meanings. So one meaning is a literal 24-hour day period, but it's also used in the Bible more figuratively to refer to a period in history. An example is from the book of Joel. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming great dreadful day of the Lord. Yom is that word. Now, of course, that's not one day. That's a whole period of history. 2 Peter 3:8, a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years like a day. Don't take that literally. It's not saying each day is 1,000 years. It's a figurative construct. Someone else has suggested that the days are like theological days. They're like God's days, which would be different than our days. And of course, if you actually read the story, 24 hours didn't really exist in the beginning anyway, did it? We didn't have a sun. in the beginning. So we might read each of these 6 days of creation as being broken into 6 periods or 6 phases, is the way I think I like to put it. As the viewer is watching, and the viewer comes in for each phase and sees a scene or is told a scene of what happens, and then he moves into another phase, and he describes it in this way. So let's walk through these phases, each of which could be hundreds of millions of years, even billions of years, as we know a year today based on the moon and the sun. So let's walk through and see what we get. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the Torah suggests there was a beginning, time when the cosmos was not here, and then when it was. And that's the consensus in the scientific community today. It suggests that the universe had a beginning. We know this as Big Bang theory, that from nothing we have a massive explosion of matter that eventually forms stars, which collect into planets, which attract moons, and we have our solar systems, etc., etc. Now, Big Bang theory is not really an explosion, but it looked that way. So material suddenly appears from something tiny, maybe like a pinprick or something like that, in a high-density, high-temperature state, expands from there, space and time expand with it. That's the idea. And so we imagine tiny particles of light, materials the size of quarks, getting blasted out and spreading out and creating the universe as we know it. It might have looked like a huge flash of light. This is a NASA picture of what the Big Bang might have looked like, a replication. Now, if we move into the next verse, verse 2, we see, now the earth was formless and void, or in chaos. Now remember, we're looking at this from what you could see if you were there. So after the Big Bang, what happens in the theory here is that raw gases and materials are constantly expanding outwards. We might think of this as a time or a period where God is preparing materials that will eventually form our sun and our moon. So God uses stars to make heavier elements. When those stars blow up, they scatter more material into other areas. The raw material is then pulled together and collected into huge gas clouds that form new stars and new solar systems. Eventually, that material that would make up our solar system would have been gathered into a gigantic, formless, chaotic gas cloud that to an onlooker would look maybe something like that. Hydrogen, helium, and heavier dust particles all a part of the mix of the whole solar system there. So our Earth is in that, in broken down elements. So then we're told we have a beginning. We move into this time when we view the elements without any form of any kind. And then we move into verse 2b, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. Try to interpret that literally. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. Now, Dr. Newman thinks that Genesis shifts angles here from looking at the gas cloud from afar to going within the gas cloud and looking at it from within. And so, again, as a vision, so what happens here is that as the gas cloud contracts under its own gravity and becomes so thick and so dense that you can't see through it anymore, it appears as though the darkness was over the deep of the cloud. You see that? So it would appear to be this thick darkness. And then we see this passage that says, God's Spirit hovers over the surface of the waters. Now, of course, we don't have a formed earth. We don't have water yet. But the Hebrew for waters, mayim, can mean sea, but we don't mean a literal sea. We mean a phenomenological sea. So this is describing what might appear like a vaporous sea swirling on the surface of this dark, dense, gaseous cloud. And this is what he's describing. Then we move on to Genesis 1:3. And God said, "Let there be light." Now, this is not, I believe, the creation of light. That happened in the beginning. That's Big Bang. But instead, as material collapses and more particles collide together, they create heat inside of this cloud. The cloud begins to glow, and to an observer, the gas cloud is now light everywhere from the inside. God created light. Here it is. Genesis 1:4, God saw the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. So inside of this gas cloud, which is glowing, that's the center part there, that's the idea. As material constricts and contracts more into the center ball, the inner parts spin faster and faster and faster and heat up more and more and more. They create magnetic fields which then grab hold of all this raw material, and then they start spinning. The raw material spins faster and faster than it normally would because of the magnetic fields. And then what happens is centrifugal force pulls that material out away, and the material is dark. The light is in the center. So what God is doing, if you were to standing on that ball looking down, is you would see God separating darkness from light. You look this way, you have light. You look this way, all the dark, black material is moving out, eventually to create our solar system. These visually dark particles, they collide together, and then they stick together and they form planets. What we know as the Earth finds its resting place in a steady orbit around the sun. Now, our Torah here jumps to a new scene from the perspective of this new Earth, rotating around the sun, spinning on its axis, so that part of the time we see glowing, part of the time we see night. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Isn't that cool? There was evening and there was morning, the first day, the first phase. Now, a lot has gone on during that day. I mean, that's a huge process that needs to happen. Major phase, from nothing to the earth. Now, we go into our next phase of creation. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Let it be for separating water from water. So God made the expanse, separated the water that was below the expanse from the water above it. God called the expanse sky, so there was evening and morning, the second day. So in the beginning, the earth is very hot, and there are asteroids crashing into each other. But eventually, everything cools on the outside. And as the earth is separated into a burning hot center with a cooler outside, what happens is the water molecules that were all attached to those dust particles break off, and they get pulled and sucked out to the surface of the earth. And we see steam, which is what we see in Genesis 2. Steam came out, the rain came out from the earth. Steam puffing out like that, and volcanoes erupting water vapor into the air and into the atmosphere. And so all of a sudden the atmosphere is filled with water in vapor form because it's very hot. Well, then what happens is as that water vapor cools, what happens? It separates, and we have an atmosphere of cloud coverage on the top, very dense at this point, you wouldn't see through it, with water that comes down and settles on the face of the earth. So God separates the water in the sky with an expanse, a space, air that he calls sky. And then the earth is filled with water. Then God said, "Let the waters below the sky be gathered into one place, let dry ground appear." And he called the dry ground land, and the collection of water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. As the earth's surface, we know, is made up of large tectonic plates that move around, and the motions of these plates raise the land up into mountains and things like that. So what happens is the land comes up, it creates these huge basins that then the water flows into, and that's what we call our oceans and our various different lakes. The waters are gathered together. Perfect picture of what we see in Genesis. Now, we move on to slide 14. God said, "Let the land sprout grass, green plants yielding seed, each according to their species, and trees making fruit with it, seeds in it, each according to its species. And God saw that it was good. So there was evening and there was morning, a third period." Every plant life, which was already beginning to develop in the waters that we had in the sea, now that we have land rising up and the seeds of that, the elements of that are on the land, exposed to light from the sun through the cloud coverage, it begins to grow into small plant life, into visual plant life, until the land that we have is covered with greenery. That's what this person would have seen who was receiving this vision. This is the most interesting one, the most challenging one, is then God said, "Let lights in the expanse of the sky be for separating the day and from night. They will be for signs and seasons and days and years. They will be lights in the expanse of the sky to shine upon the land." God saw that it was good, so there was evening and morning, a fourth day. So the question becomes, well, wait a minute. God just created the moon and the stars and everything, but didn't he do that earlier? Well, at first glance, we run into a problem because plant life is already there, which needs the sun. But we take a step back and think about this from a phenomenological perspective again. And what's going on here is that prior to plant life emerging, the cloud coverage in the atmosphere would have been so dense that the light from the sun would appear only as a glow. One could tell day from night, but couldn't tell what was actually causing it. But as plant life appears, the atmosphere becomes filled with oxygen. The oxygen clears the sky and clears the air, and for the first time, you can see the sun. God set the sun in the sky to govern the seasons and to govern the times. And then what happens is this also provides oxygen for animals. Of course, our next verse, 120. God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, let flying creatures fly across the expanse of the sky." Now, I have a picture here of the early Cambrian explosion. This is exactly what we find in the fossil record. I mean, Genesis tracks what we find in the fossil record. Amazing. We have first animal life appear in the oceans. We see kind of a long stretch of time with not much change, little bits here or there, but then, the current consensus in 100 million years ago, there's a massive explosion in the fossil record of preliminary plant life and different kinds of little animals and sea creatures and things like that just show up out of nowhere. And when you look closely at each of these fossils, you see that they have the building blocks for life that creates in various different already set species for what we know as modern life today. And it's just there. Now, just there is still a period of hundreds of millions of years. It's not like there is like a split second. It's still, but in the fossil record we see this. All of a sudden there's this massive amount of life coming out that's similar exactly to what we have today. God saw that it was good. There was evening and morning, the fifth phase of creation. Then we move into the sixth. God said, "Let land bring forth," I thought he was cute. "Let land bring forth living creatures according to their species, livestock, crawling creatures according to their species." And we see in a process that I don't know fully how to understand, we see different species coming about in our records that we see and developing from water, moving on to land. And then, of course, we see an age of the first vertebrates to, I would suggest, to dinosaurs, to mammals, to primates, to him, a yak. I think he was cute too. And God saw that it was good. And then we have in verse 26, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." And of course we see in nature, don't we, that humans are the last of the fossil record that we have, the last of day 6, last of the fossil chain. Humans are unique in creation. They're made in God's image. They're given conscious thought. We're given ability to choose right from wrong. And interestingly enough, archaeological evidence right now suggests that it was like, again, out of the blue when we start seeing artwork and we start seeing, things, tools that were made and things like that. It's like it wasn't there and then it's there all of a sudden. It's an amazing process. And I think at each of these phases is when God intervenes and comes in and says, breathes life, a new part. Now, again, because I don't have the time today, we'll have to save Adam and Eve and the garden and how all that fits together for part 2. But I think it really fits together. There's some really cool ideas of how the garden works in relationship to this whole picture of day 6. But another day because of time. But I want to close that the details of creation in Genesis match our best scientific model for the early earth and development of life. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly how it was, but that's amazing. Do you guys get that? I mean, from my perspective, it would be impossible for an ancient writer to craft a human legend that would actually follow to the T everything that modern science has confirmed today. That would be impossible. And I'm not saying everything we've discovered is right. I don't know that, but it's amazing that these two things connect in our scientific age of discovery. They'd have no reference point for any of these things happening. They'd never have heard of any of these concepts. And so to me, it's like the only possibility is that the Torah is actually true. It's actually true. That God really did pass down a story which not only contextualizes everything to come, but also was an actual visual, recreation of the creation of our universe. You and me. So God really did create the heavens and the earth. And then he told us about it. And so if it's true, I want to suggest that makes a strong case that the rest of it is true too. And to me, just to tie this into our reading today a bit, that gives me even greater confidence that the things that we read Yeshua saying in our Besorah passage today in John 14 are true. When he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. For my Father's house has many rooms, and I will go to prepare a place for you. So with that, Shabbat Shalom. And if I can call up our other leaders here, we'll close our service.
Please, oh Lord, our God, let the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths. Please, oh Lord, our God, let the words of your Torah sweet in our mouths, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel, in the mouths of your people, in the mouths of the house of Israel. And may your descendants and the descendants of your people Israel be those who know your name and study your Torah for Messiah's sake, for Messiah.